Hello, programming geeks out there. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Masamune project that I finished and uploaded or finalized it and uploaded to itch.io as well. It's available on GitHub. You can play it with the link mentioned in the video description. And I don't want to talk too much because I think those videos sometimes get too long. So I just try to quickly go through some of my notes, what things went good, what I preferred in this project and what I will also most likely use in another project, and things that I did not like a lot, which can be improved in the next project. So first of all, I want to start with the good things. I will quickly go through them, and then the bad things, which are, I think, the most interesting topics. So first of all, what I liked a lot is that I used tiles this time really good as a editor for my entire game. So I did not only created the maps in tiles, like the normal tiled maps and stuff. I also placed there some objects, and I used actually a collection of images, tile sets, to describe the different objects in my game. So for example, I have here an item object, which has all the properties that an item can have. I have enemy objects to define the enemy objects, like the life, the hit points, the abilities that they have. I can describe the NPCs. They have the information what trigger they have and things like that. So all in all, I really liked it a lot, but I will come back to that point later on because there's also something where I think that might be problematic for bigger projects and but in general, I really like tiles, a really great editor. I also donated to the guy now. I will most likely make another donation next month because really very helpful editor in my opinion and has a lot of features and it's for free, which is really great. Then what I also liked in that project is the Shaderservice class, which I documented also a little bit, which helped to abstract the shader logic for rendering away, and it's reusable for future projects as well. And for example, if I want to, for example, the dissolve shader, I think, if you want to render something in with the dissolve shader, which is when enemy dies and they pop up in these little pixels and so on and get bigger, this little effect. Then in the render service or wherever I want to render something, I just call use dissolve shader, for example, and pass in the patch and the properties which are necessary for the shader. So I don't need to set the uniforms and stuff like that myself. From a caller perspective, it's simply just calling this function and then embedding the draw functions of the sprite patch in the lambda function. So after that, and then everything that is rendered in that part here gets rendered with a dissolve shader, for example, or here with an outline shader, then everything here gets rendered with an outline. So this shader service in general, which takes care of loading the shaders, getting the different uniform indices for a faster setting of these properties, and then just sets everything according to what I need. That one was really useful and I liked it, and as mentioned, can be reused in future projects as well. Then I also liked in this project here the trigger system and the trigger configurator class, which helped to define the different triggers in the system. So for example, let's take the elder trigger as an example. So that one here, when you interact with the elder in the village, then for example here, if you have the main quest, then it just opens a dialogue. So I have a DSL, a trigger, which returns the trigger script with the different actions that will be performed. There's also a trigger system, which then runs through these triggers, actions by action. And the things like that, I didn't need, or I didn't need any conditions because it's mainly programming in Kotlin and I'm actually in the core of the project. So I have access to almost everything. And with the DSL, so with the trigger and the different action functions to do things, that really turned out quite well and is really flexible and was also used then for the final cutscene. I think that one was called Masamune trigger. That is a bigger trigger because there's actually happening quite a lot. And there, for example, I needed access to different entities in my game and needed to configure certain things. So all of that is simply possible within that trigger functionality that I developed there. I think everything can always be improved, of course, but what I have here, that's an improvement to what I did in the Quilly Adventure project a couple of years ago. And that one really turned out quite good, I would say. So it was really useful and helped a lot. Then one special shout out is the typing label library from Rafa something. So I will just open that quickly up here. So GitHub typing label that you see it. So this library here, that one is really awesome and I liked it a lot because what you can do, you can simply use it as a replacement for the Scene2D label. So there are no special adjustments necessary. If you use a Scene2D label, you can also simply use the typing label. And the typing label simply supports a couple of tokens that you can get very nice effects with your text. So for example, like here in this ease, you see here that the text eases in, or jumping, then it jumps like that. This effect, for example, I used for the combat damage numbers. So when you damage an enemy, that the damage is popping up slowly. There I used this jump effect, for example. Shake would be if a ghost or a spirit is talking with you. I used it as well. And there are just a couple of different tokens and functionalities that you can use with typing label. And the most important one for me is that it's, don't know if you see that here, but the basic effect is just that the letters appear one by one. So that really gives the retro style. And I didn't have to implement that myself. So typing label was really, really useful and very nice to use. Then there was one library that I also used in Quilly Jumper, which is the Skin Composer library. And that one here I used now way more than what I did in the Quilly Jumper project. And that one was also really useful because you can define here the different, the skin that you will use for your Scene2D layout. You can define here the colors, the fonts, the drawables. And most importantly, what helped me a lot is the scene composer in here, where you can always render or prepare a scene in Scene2D, add the different tables, play around with the different settings of expanding, filling, and so on, the different styles that you have for the different label styles and so on. And I always use that one for most of my views to get like a skeleton or a scaffold of the scene that I want to create. And then what I simply did was then export, I think, and copy to the clipboard, which gives you the Java version of the scene. And then I just converted it to libktx Kotlin extension functions that I used in the project. And yeah, that was really, really useful because normally with Scene2D, I always struggle a little bit what kind of effects certain properties have. So when I expand and fill, or when I align left, right, top, bottom, when does it work? When does it not work? There, for me, the Skin Composer library and especially the Scene Composer here really helped a lot. So I learned also a lot. I have to say that as well. Had a couple of questions and the Discord community helped there a lot from libgdx. But in general, I would suggest to learn Scene2D with the Skin Composer tool and the Scene Composer tool in it. That really helped a lot and makes it easier to understand what is happening and how your layout will look like. One thing to mention is that the scene here is always rendered with a screen viewport. So it's simply the resolution that your entire screen has. And when you use a different viewport in the game, like for example, I use an extend viewport, if I remember correctly, with a fixed resolution, then of course it looks slightly different in your game, but still it's very close to what you see here in Scene Composer. And the last thing that I tried in this project and that worked out really well was with the keyboard controls here. So there I had a key mapping where I simply map an input key to a command in my game. And then throughout the entire game, I never work with keys, so I don't check if A or space or whatever is pressed. I always check if one of the commands is happening. And there, I will come back to that point also a little bit later. There I mainly worked with events in that game. So I fired then that the command left button, for example, was fired. And then classes which need to react to such input, they can simply react to that command and do something. And an additional thing that I used here, because I used that at different occasions here in this project, was like a finite state machine that I explained in one of the GDX AI tutorials. So it's simply a finite state machine. That's nothing specific to GDX AI. And in that specific case, it's just that my keyboard controller, it always has just one active state. And a state can be, for example, the game state, or if I'm currently in the shop or in any user interface action in my or scene in my game, then it has the UI state. If I don't want to handle any input, for example, in cutscenes where you shouldn't be able to press anything, you can just watch the cutscene. There's a disabled state as well. And I simply then set always that there's just one active state for the keyboard controller, and depending on what the state does, it fires specific events. So for example, for the game state, when the left, right, down, up command are pressed, then here it updates the movement of the player. For selection, it fires the interaction event that the player wants to interact with something. So that would be the game keyboard controls. And if the active state is, for example, the user interface, then the different commands. So when you press up, down, left, right, then it just fires the user interface events that you want to go up in the menu or down or left or right, things like that. So there I use this state mechanism, and that really worked a lot. Another example, but I think I mentioned that already, was, for example, the combat system, not command system, the combat system. There I had something similar, because the combat system is a turn-based combat system, and that also was way easier to split up the different steps of a turn, of a combat turn, which is initially the player needs to select an action. The next thing would be that everything gets prepared. So the AI, for example, picks its action. Maybe special actions, so passive actions or buffs that start at the beginning of the round, they get triggered. Then we are in this endless loop of performing the different actions of the entities in the combat. And then at the end of the round, then some cleanup is happening, and turn end buff effects are happening. And the global state is a victory or defeat state, which basically means if all enemies are dead, then the player has won the battle. And if all players are dead, then the player has lost the battle. So those are some global states which are checked all the time, independent of the other states which are currently active. And there's also just one local state, let's call it like that, and one global state. So that one was really similar to the GDX AI state machine implementation. So those are just a few of the things that I liked in this project and that I wanted to highlight, because that one or those ones I really will most likely keep in future projects. Again, always the things can always be improved a little bit, but the solution in general, I like that in here. Then coming back to a couple of things that I did not like so much or which can be improved. So first of all, which is, I would say, a general problem for most developers, is that I spend a little bit too much time for certain things where I thought I could need that, but in the end, I actually never needed it at all. And one of these things was in the combat system, where I thought about, so since it's round-based, I thought about all the different things that could happen or that I wanted to implement. And one feature was, for example, that when you attack or when you cast a spell, then the enemy wants to nullify this damage, so simply reduce it to 0. Or Another effect that I implemented was a reflection. So that when someone takes damage, then he's reflecting the damage back to the attacker. And then also the combination. So you nullify the damage, but you want to reflect it. So first of all, you cannot simply reduce the damage to 0, because then for the reflection, you would not return any damage. So I needed to handle that in a specific way. And all those very crazy ideas that I had that I wanted to support in the combat system, they really, I had to spend there quite some time. And in the end, the nullify effect and also the reflection effects, I didn't use them at all. So developing them and trying to support them was not really a waste of time, because I learned, of course, from it. But for the game itself, it was a waste of time because it isn't used. And most likely I also would not introduce it. Maybe for a final boss that he has something like that. But especially in the early game where I'm currently in this project, there it doesn't make sense that an enemy already can reflect damage or nullify certain attacks. That's simply too powerful at the beginning of the game. And yeah, that's a general advice, I would say. So never overthink the features that you want to implement. Just focus on the things that you have in hand and that you really need. And all the other things that could happen or might happen in the future, don't think about that too much and don't try to support that too much. When it comes to that, then you can think about it and try to find a solution. And at that point in time, your project most likely has already changed quite a lot. So the way you implement it is anyway completely different to what you would do at the beginning. And in general, just focus to get things done. Don't think too much about what could happen or what you want to have. Try to reduce that. So I did, I would say, a decent job in this project, but still can be, of course, improved as always. Then another thing that I have in this project, which I personally did not like. I mean, it worked out in the end, but I think it's not a clean architecture. So on one side, I have a entity component system approach. So I have a couple of systems, couple of components, quite a lot, I would say. And there is the majority of the logic of the game runs in the entity component system approach. And I also have then a so-called event service, which allows to fire events and that classes can react to those events. I also had to take care of here. So if you are in a method which is reacting to an event and that method is again calling an event or adding or removing listeners and so on. So there I had to take special care here that I don't have an endless loop or modify the things I loop over and stuff like that. And in the end, in my opinion, it's a little bit of a mixture of two completely different approaches. On one side, you have the event-driven development, which would be the event service. And on the other side, I have the entity component system, which should mainly get updated or notified, I would say, via component changes or updates. The reason why I went for that is that in other projects where I strictly used ECS, that sometimes it was a little bit problematic because, of course, when you just, or if you strictly work in an ECS environment, then you have the different systems and they just get called in a sequence for each frame or every loop in your game. And one thing that can happen, for example, in a move system, let's say you somehow change the facing direction because you move in a different direction, but the facing doesn't get updated here because that one gets maybe updated in a separate system here at the end. And then also the rendering, where you need to update the graphic that it looks to the east or to the west or whatever. That's maybe also happening in another system a little bit later. And in general, there's always a little bit of a delay until your data is updated properly. You could always do everything at that point in time where you do it. So for example, when I move from right to the left, then inside the move system, I could already update the graphic, the facing, and all the other things that would be related to that. But I would not like that approach either, because the move system should not be responsible for that, and it shouldn't even know if there is a graphical representation or not. It doesn't care. It just sets the move speed and maybe moves the player from A to B, and that's it. It shouldn't care about other things. And with that approach, as mentioned, you simply have a little bit of a delay until all the components are up to date with the latest data. And there, in some projects, I had a problem a little bit that some of the systems, they already expected that the data is properly updated when they are reached, but it wasn't like that. So they worked for one frame, they worked on an old data, which was sometimes problematic. And that was the reason why in this game, I always tried to set everything immediately. And that was the main reason why I introduced this event service, because when I fire an event, like for example, to give you one example, in the keyboard controller, we had the game state, and there we had this update move function where you press left, right, up or down key. And update movement is simply firing a player move event. And now, I don't know which systems, but a few systems, you can see it here, the facing system, the move system, the player interact system, they are reacting to this event and immediately modifying the component data. So there I had the chance, or it was then possible to immediately update all the data when something is happening, and I didn't have to wait for all the different systems to get called and to update the component data. And so again, to summarize it, I would not do that anymore in a future project, because in my opinion, it breaks a little bit the design of the project. If you have both an event-driven design and an entity component system design, I could be wrong, so we can have a discussion. So if someone has a different opinion, then just write it in the comments and let's talk about it. But in my opinion, it's not a clean architecture. I would say either use one or the other. Events, of course, they always make sense at some point, and you will need that. But I wouldn't drive the game logic via events if I have an entity component system architecture. That is my main point. Okay, then coming back to tiled. So before I mentioned that I really liked it a lot, using it as an editor, and it was really useful also for cutscenes, for example. I had it as support, so I could define, for example, for cutscenes, I defined here a spawn point where an NPC is spawning. Then he's following that path down there. Then there's some dialogue appearing. Then another entity spawns there at the spawn demon 2. It moves down that path, stops, and then does something. There is the spawn location of the final boss here of the first demonstration of the game, the first demo, and things like that. So for that, it's really useful, helped a lot. But where I think I would struggle, and I already struggled here in this project, is a little bit if the game gets bigger. So as mentioned, I already have different kind of objects in my game. I have an NPC object, which just requires the atlas where the graphic is stored. The image defines the key of the atlas. Then a specific enum, which might not even be necessary, but I have to identify certain objects at some point, and a trigger name to know what kind of trigger is attached to the NPC. Or for items, I have, if it gives you a specific ability, you can define that here, then the different attributes that it has, and stuff like that. So that worked out, but if the game gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and right now it's really, I would say, a small game. So I have, I think, 4 maps in total, with just some, if you play it, it's like half an hour, at most 1 hour, I would say. If you play it, then you are through with that game. And there already I have a page of objects. Now imagine if you have a real game, which is a lot bigger than this one, that you have here hundreds of objects. And from what I know, there is no search functionality and things like that. So it will be a little bit overwhelming of what kind of things you see here. You could discuss here that you maybe want to split it then up. So I could have one tile set for items, one tile set for enemies, one tile set for NPCs. Still, I think it's a little bit too overwhelming. At some point, you need a filter or search functionality at some point, and don't just identify things by the image. Another downside is that, at least currently, with the out-of-the-box functionality of libgdx, you always need to load a map to get the tile set. So to get this object's information, I need to have a map which has the object's tile set, which, since I needed that in that game, every map that I have references this object's tile set so that I have access to my game objects, which is, of course, also not ideal. In my opinion, that should be something separate. So what I would most likely do in a project, if it gets bigger, I would simply write my own editor, which doesn't have to be super fancy, but as mentioned, it then simply splits between items, enemies, NPCs, maybe has then some additional functionality which tiled cannot even support. So one feature that I'm missing, but which might come in the near future, is, for example, I also wanted to define a loot table for enemies so that I can define what kind of items they are dropping. And currently that would not be possible. So I can, of course, you can always just make a string and write down there what you want to have and then parse the string. But what would be better would be like a table where I say, for example, this butterfly, it can drop a small life potion with a probability of 20%, for example. Things like that are currently not possible to define in tiled, but that comes in the near future from what I know. So also here, to summarize these points, I would go for a separate editor if you work on a real project that should become bigger, and use tiled maybe just at the beginning for some quick ideas or to get the development going. But at some point, I would move away from tiled and really write your own stuff, most likely for that. Okay, then another thing, that's the second to last point that I have. So I mentioned that I used Skin Composer, which really helped a lot. Also at the beginning, I was really working nicely to reuse things also in the future. So I had even separate styles defined for my dialogue class, which has a background, which has an optional frame for an NPC image, which has a label style for the different text and for the different options that you can select. So I had a dialogue and the dialogue option class, loaded that in the game as well and used it. So that one was really useful. But in the end, as always, when time moves on and I want to finish certain features, then I don't implement them in the nicest way all the time. I just want to get going and complete something. And in the end, what I have in the user interface package, I used the model view model approach again that I described in one of the tutorials. I think it was the latest one with, I forgot it, this RPG adventure cookbook thingy. And so I have a couple of models, a couple of view classes, and quite a lot of different widget classes. A widget for me would be, for example, the option table in the dialogue, that I have a selectable menu with different options that which indicates what option I've currently selected. Then, for example, there's for the stats overview in the shop, I have a widget for the different labels and stuff like that. So anyway, for quite a few of, let's call it components, I think this is how it's called in the front-end development. For the different components, I have certain classes. And I did not really implement them in a reusable way. So, for example, you can see it here. I have a widget which is called Magic Table, which is really specific to the Masamune project. I cannot even remember which one it is because some of these have very redundant names, I would say, and it's not easy to identify which one that is. Okay, that one is the scrollable selection table. So I think that's the one that you see in the combat when you want to select a magic that you want to use. Then you get this table. So in the end, it's a scrollable table with a scroll bar, then a list of entries, just one entry per. Okay, it's actually, I made it modifiable. It's 2 entries per row. And yeah, you can navigate through that. And yeah, what I would do in a future project is really like develop a component library. So make it a very generic implementation that can be reused for future projects as well. Because as it is right here, I could copy paste that over to another project, but there are quite a lot of things that would need to be adjusted. So ideally, I would have here a styling class, for example, for this magic table. It wouldn't even be called magic table, maybe something like scrollable selection table or something like that, with a styling class here where you can define all the different styles that you want to have, and then implement here really a nice component that can be used in other projects. So that would be something for a future project that I really use here, or implement here a reusable component library for certain Scene2D things. Okay, and last, I want to say that certain features are really not implemented in a nice way. The reason is that at the beginning, I always work quite regularly on the project usually, and then I really document things, add the comments, refactor quite a lot to make it really look nice. And at some point, I'm simply over that point where I want to do everything nicely, and I just want to get to the finish point and finalize the project. And then I really implement certain things in a not good way. From a player point of view, you never see that, so it doesn't matter. But for me personally, it's not implemented then in a nice way. And one example would be, for example, the main view, where I copy paste quite a few of options. Let me quickly start up the game, that you just see what I mean. I will then close it because I think the music might be too loud. And maybe the sound effects. It needs to build because I updated it before. So here it is. Let me make it not so loud. So this main menu here that you see here, where you can switch the language, you can close the game, you can continue from the last save state, you can start a new game. So that one is really not implemented in a nice way, because as you have seen before, I would actually have like something like a selection table with the different options and so on. And what I ended up with, that this code block that you see here, I simply copy pasted that like 5 times. And then when you on down pressed, I think is the method, there have then a very weird Scene2D magic stuff going on. So somehow I know what kind of line is selected. A line is always a table. From that table, I know that the first children is the selection arrow index. Then I make the selection arrow visible or not. So it's really implemented in a hacky way. But again, it worked, and that was the main point. But in general, as always, at the end of the project, some of the features are just not implemented in a nice way. I think that's just how it is. The important part is that, in my opinion, you finish something, you finish a project, and that is more important than having the nicest code ever and never finalize a project. Good. Yeah, that's it. So if you have any questions or if you have feedback about the game, I'm happy to read that. Again, the link is in the video description. Otherwise, just write a comment and I try to answer it as quick as possible. Thanks for watching and have a nice rest of your Sunday. Bye bye.